overview of JourneyTEAM. You've probably seen this a little bit, but I would say, hey, the big call out here that I think is helpful is that we are certainly full stack and deal with a lot of different parts of the Microsoft ecosystem. And that's fun because we get to hear from guys across a broad spectrum. And specifically here, we're going to be hanging out in the ERP world. And there are a number of different products and services, some cloud, some on-prem. So looking forward to today's presentation from Jared and Jeff.
Welcome to the summit. Thanks, Michael, for giving us a little bit of an introduction. My name is Jared Mickelson. Also with us on the phone is Jeffrey Wixom, and he is a wonderful addition to the JourneyTEAM group. He has many years of experience with manufacturing, warehousing, inventory management. He's kind of an overall supply chain guru. And then myself, I've spent a few years in the ERP space as well. I've implemented numerous ERP systems, and I have been in this space for well over 10 years so far. Today, what we want to talk about is kind of a broad topic: refining warehousing and manufacturing practices. Now, with that said, what we want to talk about, what Jeffrey and I have felt as we've been implementing these systems for years, things that as companies install new systems or are trying to leverage more of the system, what are some of the things that they run into with regards to keeping their warehousing running, keeping their manufacturing operations running? And we wanted to go over some of the key things that we have found that companies either think they're doing or could always do just a little bit better. And these are really the basics. These are the fundamentals of what you can do to approach warehousing and manufacturing and overall inventory management with regards to any ERP system you're using. And after we get done with the presentation, we are happy to take questions regarding whatever related questions you may have around the ERP system, around manufacturing, on warehousing, inventory management, etc. What I want to go through first is cover a few of some basic topics, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we're starting off from square one. Then we're going to look at a little bit of process analysis, looking at what we need to make sure we get covered and where we've seen a lot of companies fall short when it comes to setting up data. Then we're going to get into some warehousing general practices where we recommend spending some extra time. And then we're going to get into a little bit of the manufacturing side, and then ending out with some measurements and some KPIs with reporting. First and foremost, given today's market, in your warehouse and your manufacturing floor, there's a couple things that I want to emphasize that are agnostic of any system. One, safety first. Given today's market, employees are pretty much a company's #1 asset, and keeping them safe should be a top priority. Just a side note on that is 2019, the National Safety Council estimates that the total cost of work injuries was about $171 billion, and each medically consulted injury was costed around $42,000. While obviously workers are not looked at in dollars and cents, they are humans. Keeping your employees safe is always a good idea, and it always helps the bottom line. Secondly, I've been in way too many warehouses and manufacturing facilities, at least in a storage area, where the organization could use a little bit of help. Sometimes people are just too busy. If business is good, sometimes it's just too busy to kind of get some of these boxes cleaned up and get the floor cleaned up. When you have a warehouse that's a little bit in chaos, it's definitely harder to get product out the door, get product over to different parts of the warehouse where they need to be. So listen to your mother and clean up after yourself. Keeping the space clean and organized is always the best bet. So as we get into our warehousing and manufacturing procedures, what I want to talk about a little bit was process evaluation. What we find one of the biggest issues when implementing new systems, especially around warehousing and manufacturing that are so process heavy, is that people generally know what they're doing, they don't always know why they're doing what they're doing. Sometimes it's system related, sometimes it's tradition legacy related, sometimes it's just because nobody showed them how to do what they're doing, so they just kind of figured it out on their own, and they don't quite understand what's really happening behind the scenes. So a question I have for most people is, do you know what's happening in your facility, in your warehouse, on your manufacturing floor? When you start getting into process evaluation, especially with warehousing and manufacturing, it can be quite overwhelming, because most places have quite a few processes to go through. My recommendation is to start small. Pick a single process. Pick something that you know you can walk end to end through. And as you go through that process, make sure you're figuring out what value that process adds to your business and adds to the overall goal of getting that product out the door, getting the product manufactured, getting the customer's needs taken care of. Um, One thing that I always like is that when you're doing this process evaluation, always ask too many why questions. Sometimes it gets annoying for some people, but asking why is how you figure out the true nature of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Again, a lot of times you figure out that a lot of people don't know why they're doing things. And so as you start trying to dissect a process and do something better, you find out that you don't really know why things are happening. So it's hard to make something better without figuring out the root cause. And then after all said and done, probably the hardest thing to do is document what you've found. And as you've document it in a way that is easily consumable by most people. I know sometimes you get into process flow diagrams and Visio diagrams and long Excel spreadsheets. Sometimes they're overwhelming and people don't quite like to read through all of those. Sometimes they're necessary, but make sure that you document what you find, and as things change, you are updating those documents. Along with the evaluation is process standardization and making sure that whatever you're generally doing consistently and the same as much as possible. It's really difficult to train and improve upon a process that isn't consistently doing the same things. So the recommendation is always to standardize to the extent that you can. It's hard to measure something that's always different, and it's hard to know if you're improving if the target's always changing. This quote by Otto von Bismarck is kind of a standard quote, but it's something that I've always tried to live by, where it's better to have a good plan that's well executed than a bad plan. I'm sorry, a good plan that's poorly executed than a bad plan that is well executed. It's definitely hard to progress if you're always doing something different. When it comes to ERP systems, the big thing that we see, especially going live and moving forward, is how people are managing data. More specifically, how people are keeping the quality of the data that people are keeping in the system. There's always the old adage of garbage in, garbage out. If you put garbage into the system, you're always going to get garbage out of the system. We've seen it happen many times where companies haven't spent the time to make sure that the data going in or the existing data is clean enough so that the system can do what it does well and calculate and make recommendations. And so in turn, people lose faith in the ERP system that they've spent so much time and effort and money trying to implement. And so some things that we always try to make sure with any new implementation and ongoing implementation is that the data quality is following 4 factors that we like to kind of adhere to. One is the data complete. Are you missing data? Do you have bills and materials that are missing scrap? Do you have items that are missing weights? Do you have lead times that are missing? Secondly, if you're entering data into the system, is that data accurate? When was the last time that you took the time to figure out what the lead time from a particular vendor or the lead time of a particular shipment using a particular carrier really is in the system, so you can plan for that? Secondly, are you consistent with entering your data into the system? Consistency and entering the data in as it changes as you figure it out is key to making sure that the system is always operating as it should. And lastly, we want to make sure that the data that you're taking so much time to gather is actually valuable. Sometimes if you add the weight of an item, but you're not doing anything with that weight, taking that extra time to add that a particular item weighs 10 pounds probably doesn't help you very much. But taking that same amount of time to make sure that you've got a default vendor, or that you know the economic order quantities or order multiples of this item, is probably a little bit more valuable, adds a little bit more value to your data sets. Lastly, with data management, one thing that luckily technology is helping out quite a bit with is trying your absolute best to have real-time data transactions. Now, with WMSs and manufacturing software packages, obviously there's usually some sort of mobile device with scanning or things of that nature, where you have the opportunity to scan an item, move an item to a different location, consume an item in near real time. Those sort of transactions is what allows you to continue to leverage a WMS system or a manufacturing execution system to use it to its fullest extent, so the system can be planning and operating at the same time that your business is running, and you're not trying to process things and then go do work. You can be processing and doing work at the same time. With warehousing and manufacturing, one of the key things is how you set up your inventory. And we alluded to this a little bit with the data management concept, but when you set up inventory, have you taken the time to set up your items and your bills of materials and whatnot with all of the necessary information that you have? We chat with a lot of clients, and we have quite a few clients that have spent a lot of time setting up their existing ERP system, or setting up a legacy ERP system that they're going to move into a new ERP system. And we asked a lot of these questions about, well, how do you have your numbering, and do you have all this data? And a lot of times they say, yep, we got it all. And they're very happy. And we're happy when we hear that. And then when the time comes to transfer all that data or run some reports on certain data points that hasn't been looked at in a little while, we find that data probably was accurate a few years ago, maybe even a few months ago, but over the course of an ever-changing economy and an ever-changing landscape, data's changed. And so keeping up with that inventory setup is paramount to making sure the system is operating. Things such as item numbers, right? When you create new items in the system, are they kind of following a form, fit, and function mentality? When you are looking at creating a new item number, are you just creating a new item number that is actually the same item, but you just want a different item number, and so you cause confusion in the system? Or are you looking at each product that you want to set up and asking, does it have the same form, fit, and function as something else, or is it different and therefore deserving of a different item number? Simple things such as dimensions of a product, weight, length, height, width, things like that, especially in a warehousing management system where you're looking at potential picking, packing, and shipping. Having that information in the system can be very beneficial to saving you precious time downstream. Again, lead times such as vendor lead times, production lead times, different operational lead times. Everybody wants good planning and forecasting, but those only come when you are telling the system what sort of lead times that you have. On the same note with those economic quantities, if you don't know what your order multiples are, or what your vendors, your lot size that you need to order from a particular vendor, or what size of product or what size of order just financially makes sense from a shipping charge, again, the system will struggle to try to plan those things for you, because it will always be trying to plan things that probably don't fit into what your actual situation entails. lastly, the thing that I've found with a lot of clients is the concept that is lacking with a lot of clients is the ABC classification. When I think of ABC classification, I think of determining items based on their value, and that may be monetarily, that may be on their use, and how important they are to your organization. Giving items an ABC classification helps you to know and keep track of items that, one, you maybe can't ever run out of, or items that maybe allow you a little more leeway when planning. Part of that also includes when you're doing your inventory counting. Um, a lot of people try to do various methods of inventory counting. I've noticed that depending on the warehouse, depending on the facility, sometimes they don't always get around to what most people consider the better practice of counting would be a cycle count. With ABC classification, that allows you to cycle count particular items monthly, quarterly, yearly, and allows you to classify that. And especially with most ERP systems, Business Central that's up on the screen, if you tell the system what ABC classification it has, the system will do all of the work for you when it comes to remembering what items need to be counted and when. And all you need to do is click a couple buttons, and the system will give you count sheets for you to go count. As we get into more inventory management and warehousing principles, one of the big things that we want to go over is when we talk about receiving. When I think about receiving, I think of it being one of the most important features in the warehouse. And why? That's because the warehouse or the receiving features sets the tone for almost all of the products that come into the warehouse. If the receiving process is rushed, usually mistakes are made, and those mistakes usually manifest themselves downstream when time is of the essence. Some of the ways that we can make sure that our receiving processes are better and squared away. One, if you have the opportunity to find vendors and certify those vendors so that you're not having to do as many quality checks and you're not having to relump pallets of product and repackage them and and double check everything. If you have vendors that you've qualified to be a supplier of yours, having them be able to pass certain validations that you would like them can help with your receiving process. If you don't have the opportunity for certified vendors, or if you would like more, some of the general receiving processes that can help get product in and out faster. One is to be able to schedule those receipts. If you have the ability to schedule incoming receipts, that you can know that a certain truckload with a certain product is showing up on a certain date. It makes it a lot easier to plan for capacity of workers to be able to make sure that you have the necessary processes available if there's a quality check, and to make sure that you have the open dock space and the open put away space for you to put products away. Another thing is with that scheduled receipt, that allows you to be able to get to that, have a workforce that is available and waiting to handle those goods as soon as it shows up on the dock door. And part of that is also verifying those goods upon delivery as quickly as possible, and allowing your AP clerk or your AR clerk to handle that three-way matching of the invoice and the packing slip to make sure that everything is on the up and up. And lastly, in order to get product ready for picking and ready for use, you need to make sure you get that product put away quickly. We all know that these are all common things, but sadly, we've seen way too many companies that fall prey to letting things sit on the dock and letting inventory just kind of sit idle. And then when it's needed the next day, that afternoon, it's more difficult to go and get that inventory. And so with receiving, again, I think it's one of the most crucial processes of a warehouse. And if you can make sure that a product gets received and put away quickly and accurately, it sets the tone for all of your picking, your inventory movements, and your shipping downstream. As we get a little bit further downstream, we get into warehousing order picking. And with order picking, this is where it gets interesting because you can go many different routes with that, depending on the size of your facility, depending on how many employees you have, depending on your processes, depending on the goods that you're picking. Most everybody likes the idea of seeing robots roam around their warehouse. Everybody sees Amazon on TV or sees these high-tech warehouses where companies will spend a lot of money and time automating their picking processes. And I always recommend that when you do your process analysis, you're always keeping your eye out for places that you know you can automate. With most WMS systems, there usually is some sort of device application that allows for scanning, but also there are ways that you can introduce conveyor belts, scales, optical scanners, auto labelers, right? For tasks that become very repetitive, that if you've standardized, that you can introduce things that can reduce the necessary labor and replace that with a machine in certain regards, again, such as an auto labeler or even a box tape, box sealer. As we go through the warehouse, most facilities generally use the picking methodology that is thought of as person to goods, where somebody's walking around with some sort of mobile device or even just a pallet jack, and they are going to each location in the warehouse. And this is called generally thought of as person to goods. Within that, there's kind of three common picking methodologies that happen within that. The very basic and the first and foremost way people usually go pick orders is order by order. They'll take a customer 123, and they'll print out their sales order. And they'll hand it to somebody in the warehouse, and that person will go walk around the warehouse and picking whatever is necessary, and then generally go drop it off at some sort of packaging station. As we get into other methodologies, you start getting into batch and wave picking. And sometimes these can get confused for one or the other. And sometimes a lot of people end up doing a hybrid. But generally speaking, when you think of batch picking is picking multiple orders at once. Usually this is really good for warehouses that stock small and similarly shaped products that fit into, say, a pick cart or fit into some sort of picking help that you might have. When you get into wave picking starts to turn into picking single orders, but generally during specified time windows, or it helps you release orders that might have a very special picking method, or if you want to release orders based on, say, a portion of the warehouse. A lot of times people will release wave picking that they might send out orders to, say, a refrigerated section of a warehouse, and then a frozen section, and then maybe a bulk section to try to keep traffic down as they're going throughout the warehouse. The picking methodology I wanted to just to touch on for 1 second was called the goods to person. This is the high dollar, high volume, very large warehouse methodology that you see, but it can pay dividends depending on your product mix and how many products that you're trying to send out. Generally, this requires a large investment, but it requires a large upfront setup, but it can help out with your labor shortages where you don't need very many people to pick product. The downside to that is it is not as scalable without doing some major construction to your facility, with adding a lot more racking and things of that nature. And it also generally requires a skilled workforce in the background that can add to your investments that are necessary. Pardon me. As we go through our next kind of warehousing process, we start getting into our packing and shipping situations. And generally speaking, most ERP systems traditionally want you to pick an order, and take that order to some sort of packaging station. Before the before the advent of APIs and making them very available to integrate directly to carriers, a lot of warehouses used to have to, especially parcel heavy warehouses, you would have some sort of FedEx ship manager or UPS World Ship installed on some computer that you have to call FedEx for help every time they do an update, and keep things up and running that way. With API, with all of these carriers now releasing APIs that allow you to integrate directly to their databases, it allows you to make calls and get shipping information in various other shipping software packages. And there are many of these options out there. With Business Central has leveraged the concept of extensions, which allows an entire marketplace to add wonderful functionality to existing Business Central through the method of extensions. Those extensions allow for direct connections to all of the major carriers, and it allows for many different players in the game to cater an extension to different industries, especially with the shipping. Once we have these software packages connected to these different carriers, this allows for a nice option called rate shopping. Now, rate shopping isn't always very popular with a lot of our clients, just in the fact of they've probably spent a lot of time trying to get a carrier contract set up with FedEx or maybe UPS so they can get the cheapest rate possible. But what's nice about rate shopping is if you haven't locked yourself into a carrier contract, you have the opportunity to go out and search multiple carriers for the same shipment, and then figure out which would best suit your needs. It allows you to even take advantage of regional carriers that might be a little bit harder to handle, and you can get multiple options all at the same time. On that same note, with these new shipping software packages, it has also given the shippers and the carriers the ability to have much more accurate data. One thing that's been introduced not in fairly recently is the concept of dimensional weights, especially with the advent of the e-commerce and having so many smaller parcels come through. Is carriers have introduced dimensional weights that take into account not just actual weight, but the dimensions of the package themselves. And with these APIs and these shipping software, if you enter those dimensions into the system, you can get a near exact cost for your shipment. And depending on if you are going to pass that cost on to the customer, or if you've charged, say, the customer a flat rate, but sometimes that actual cost is different than the flat rate, it allows you to track within the ERP system and the shipping software what the flat rate that was charged as compared to the actual rate, so that you can keep track of how much you're spending on shipping versus how much you're taking in for the shipping charges. If you don't have a carrier contract set up with, say, UPS or FedEx, the one piece of information, the one tip I would give you is, if you're going to sit down with them, come prepared with your order volume so that you can make sure that you negotiate the best rate you can. You can also go through a freight broker that will basically sell you their contract and use their rates for you, and you pay a small fee on top of that. As we get out of the packing and shipping, what we have is we're getting a little bit into the manufacturing. Now, the manufacturing piece gets a little difficult as well, because everybody manufactures just a little differently. And that's where you can get a lot of proprietary functions, especially depending on your product mix. Within the manufacturing, the big things that we always try to emphasize with our clients is that quality generally should trump quantity. And that when you're building product, that you want to make sure that you make sure that you are ensuring quality at each step of the process, so that you're not going to send bad product and waste further on down the line of your manufacturing process. This is definitely a more of a lean approach, but it's very applicable even if you're not a lean focused organization. Again, one thing with producing a good product is making sure that you have quality is the focus before you focus on the quantity. Obviously, there's always a dance between how many you can make and how much and how well the product is made. And there's always going to be scrap and always going to be waste. But focusing on quality before quantity generally has been the best approach that we've seen. Years ago, I was on a project where it was for a major furniture manufacturer. And this furniture manufacturer was trying to figure out how they could get their efficiencies up. And they were just having so much waste at the end of the line. Come to find out that they were rewarding their employees based on quantity and not the quality of the work. So at the end of the line, the dumpsters would just be full of all these half-made chairs because employees were just making sure they were doing what they would be rewarded most for. And so when you're dealing with your employees, make sure that you reward your employees based on the approach that you want to take. And again, the recommendation for us is always quality over quantity. As you're looking at your manufacturing systems and your processes, one of the big things that is very common is how can somebody minimize their work in process? And there's generally four. There's many ways to go about it, but here are four of them that I generally try to follow. When we're doing our process analysis that I talked about at the beginning of this, hopefully that has shown you what some of the bottlenecks might be in your manufacturing processes. And when you find the bottlenecks, then you can start working on fixing the bottlenecks. And sometimes they're an easy fix, such as a worn out piece of machinery. And sometimes it's a hard fix, such as a complete revamp of a manufacturing process. Secondly, where appropriate, implement just-in-time principles. And just-in-time principles can be hard to implement. Sometimes it feels like you're just pushing the buck down the line. But a lot of the times, what you can do is make sure that you are building what you need when you need it. And that's, again, where the data quality comes into play, where good planning comes into play. Also, as you're processing your goods and manufacturing, make sure that your workers are trained as best they can. Either that's cross-training, either that's allowing new employees to shadow a great worker versus a mediocre worker. And sometimes that means putting people in jobs because it's better suited for them instead of rotating as many employees. And as always, with technology, there is places to automate manufacturing. And based on your process evaluation, always automate based on those needs. Sometimes it's fun to think about automation and reducing headcount, but a lot of times that automation can cost more than headcount depending on your goal. When we're dealing with these various manufacturing and warehousing processes, something that can get overlooked, at least in the beginning of a new ERP implementation, are what KPIs and metrics do you really want to measure your facility by? One of the big things that we see is companies don't keep up with their inventory counts, and in turn, they start to get bigger inventory variances than they would like. And so having the appropriate metrics in the system to know how much inventory you're losing from warehousing operations, manufacturing operations is important to making sure that you have your inventory numbers straight. Another metric that is hard to accomplish but can be very beneficial is knowing when you've made picking and shipping mistakes. Sometimes facilities will have a quality check every 10 orders. Sometimes they won't find out until they get a call from the customer. And if that's the case, if companies need to have a way for those complaints from the customer and return orders to trace back to the original order so that you can either figure out if that needs to be a training issue or if you've got a vendor issue with case counts or whatnot. As we talked about earlier as well, with the receiving process, knowing your dock to stock with your receipts and knowing how long it takes to ship out a product as well is crucial in making sure that you can plan your operations in its capacity effectively. Another issue that we have is making sure that you are keeping track of how much waste you have in your manufacturing processes. Usually that's pretty high on most people's list, and making sure that that is accurate is always a good thing. The last thing when it comes to a metric that I wanted to touch on was the cost of reverse logistics. We talk to a lot of companies, and they always want clients to either return product to the facility or do something with that product that probably ends up taking more money and time than the product is actually worth. And so what I'd recommend is monitoring how those returns and monitoring how much it's costing you for that, and making sure that when you're asking clients and customers to return product in the case that that needs to happen, that you understand the true costs from those. As we talk about the term better practices and best practices and all that, one thing that I always try to keep in mind is there's best practices according to white papers, and then there's best practices according to your company. And whatever practice you can implement that makes you a little bit better than you started, to me, is a great way to go. Getting caught up in what somebody else considers a best practice may not be the best way to go for your company. And so I always recommend that you strive to be just a little bit better and a little bit better, instead of always looking to go from 0 to 100. I recommend to keep it simple and to keep it controlled, and to know and to have a plan of action when it comes to improving how you guys operate in your warehouses and your manufacturing facility. And with that, that is the presentation on that regarding manufacturing and warehousing.